thank you for watching our video. My name is Martin Jimenez. I'm the program manager for Pivot Northwest. And I'm here with some of the members of the team so that we can take you through a set of data that we've been gathering since the fall and that we've been processing and that we're about to release through our website, pivotnw.org. Let me introduce you to our team. Go ahead, Matea.
All right. My name is Matea Krogstad, and I'm an industrial organizational psychology PhD student here on the Pivot Northwest team.
I'm Mackenzie Allison, and I'm also an IO PhD student on the Pivot Northwest team.
My name is Jeff Cuse. I'm a theology professor at Seattle Pacific University and executive director of Pivot Northwest.
I'm Gabrielle Metzler, and like Matea and Mac, I'm also an IO psychology PhD student on the data team here at Pivot Northwest.
So each of the three questions that you see on this first slide were essentially assigned out to our three PhD candidate students to research. And you can see the first slide versus the second slide is sort of the more academic version of the questions versus the more, what does it actually mean in terms of asking that question on a Sunday morning, or at a weekly Bible study. The first set of questions the first question really, in the first set of data, we're going to hear from Mackenzie about.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we did 3 surveys, and we had around 300 to 400 participants for each one of our surveys. And in this sample, we had about 50% participants from the PNW and 50% from the entire United States. As well as for the first 2 surveys, it was a Christian and non-Christian participants, where the third survey that Matea is going to talk about was all Christian participants. But for this survey in particular, we were really looking at, why do and don't young adults attend church? And through the scientific literature that we went through, we were able to come up with 20 on-ramps and 23 off-ramps that we were able to ask each participant how strongly disagree or agree. Do you think each one of these on-ramps and off-ramps are true to you? And on this slide, you will see the top 5 on-ramps and off-ramps that came from that part of the survey. And on this next slide, we wanted to see, okay, so based off of those top 5, what is actually predicting whether or not they are attending church? So this is on a scale of 0 to 1, how strong of a relationship is attendance. And you can see that the top 5 kind of vary for the on-ramps and off-ramps of what's actually predicting attendance. So on this slide, you can see church is essential for my growth as a person was the strongest predictor of attendance for church. And on this next slide, same thing with the relationship from 0 to 1. How strongly can we predict young adults not attending church? And the strongest predictor here was churches are not authentic and transparent spaces.
And before we move on, I think it's really interesting to note that, so the first slide that Mackenzie talked about was looking at what do young adults agree with or not agree with, or what do young adults agree with most for why they do or don't go to church. And just noticing that it's different what they agree with most versus what actually predicts attendance. I think that's kind of an interesting nuance to pick up there.
Mm-hmm. So we've got some reflection questions, and feel free to pause this video at the point of the reflection questions if you're in a group and you want to take a moment to discuss or even rewind and listen again. This is a lot to take in. The 3 questions: why do or don't young adults in your community go to church? How does your experience compare with the data we've collected? And how do these answers compare with what you hear? Jeff, would you like to make a comment on this first set of data?
Yeah, right off the bat, as Mac presented the survey data and findings of on-ramps and off-ramps, one of the parts that we really wanted to get into is a conversation of why young adults are not part of your community, or are they? And what are we saying? And one of the things that I think would be really important for your community to get into is to really listen to the reasons why and the reasons why not young people are attending in your community and outside of it. But then as you hear that, how does it work with the way you've kind of described yourself as a community? Are you being seen and perceived differently than you perceive yourself? Are there ways that you can change that narrative? One of the things I think is really important to attend to is in the off-ramps parts. One of the high marks that they said was that churches are resistant to change. And we find that a really important narrative that we're hearing over and over again. And is that true for your community? Are you resistant to change, and on what would be some of the questions I would think you would lean into?
A lot of this data collecting, we're relying on previous data collection for some of our phrasing. And so some of these phrases that we've asked young adults to identify with is not exactly going to be maybe what they'll use in your community or with you. And that's okay if they don't line up. In fact, listen to those nuances, because that's an important part of listening to what young adults are saying in your context, as opposed to, the somewhat antiseptic survey gathering. Next, Gabrielle will take us through the next set of data.
Yeah, so for this next survey, our thought process was that maybe one of the reasons young adults are attending church less now than they used to is because now all of their values are being fulfilled by other places or other roles in their lives instead of the church. So to start the survey off, we looked at the literature, some articles and some popular books on what are the top core values for young adults. And we came up with this list of 11 values you can see on this slide. And then with those, we asked participants in our surveys to rate their importance and satisfaction for each value. So for example, for autonomy, we'd ask them how important is autonomy to you and how satisfied are you in autonomy. And then looking across all of these values here in those scores, you'll notice that one interesting finding is that for spiritual growth, that was not only their least important value, but that was also the only one where they rated higher in satisfaction than importance for that value. So it's as if they're not only thinking it's not important, but they already feel they're doing more than enough. So next, we identified 5 main places where young adults will spend time, or roles or communities. So we have the church, housemates or non-family, family, work, and school. And then we also asked them what their third place was, or in other words, outside of home and work, where do you spend the most value, spend the most time, and gain the most value. Comparing all these different places and looking at what are the top 3 values each of these roles or communities fulfill, it was interesting that the church, top 3 for the church would be spiritual growth, peace, and social transformation. And for spiritual growth and social transformation, those 2 weren't in the top 3 for other places. So it does look like the church contributes something pretty unique to young adults. So next, we, for that third place, we looked at all these different responses that participants are allowed to just type in, what is your third place? And one interesting finding is that those top 5, for quite a few of those, it was outdoor exercise type, physically embodied type places or type activities. So that was really interesting. And then we also compared the church in the third place and how much that's fulfilling their top values. And for pretty much everything, the third place fulfilled those values more so than the church, with the exception of spiritual growth. So next, because as Mac previously said, part of our sample was the Pacific Northwest, part was the rest of the US, we went ahead and compared those perceptions for how the church fulfills these values. And for pretty much everything, the US church fulfilled those more so than the Pacific Northwest church. We do not yet have reasons for that, but that was something pretty interesting.
So here's another chance to pause and talk with your team to go over these questions for reflection. Which, if any, of these values does your church naturally demonstrate? Which values do you wish were more present? And finally, this is a little different sort of way to have a conversation. Use the terms I like, I wish, or I wonder if to go into a deeper conversation of what could possibly be. Jeff, what can you say about this data that is interesting to you theologically or from the perspective of the church?
One of the things that we really wanted to get into with this survey, as we looked at it both nationally and also in the region of the Pacific Northwest, is there are key places and types of places that attract people. They want to be known, they want to be seen, and one of the things we found is they also want to be active. In what way, shape, or form do these types of places model what the church is? One of the parts that may be hard, and certainly something to reflect on, is how many young adults talk about how not fun the church is compared to everywhere else that they seem to be hanging out. Mm-hmm. Is it okay that the church is not a fun place, or should it be more fun? That's a great question to ask. And what does fun even mean? Mm-hmm. Right? Would be a great one to explore. Joy, meaning, community. A lot of things come with this idea of hospitality and a lot of things the church offers. But if the church is seen as a place that's not fun, why is that? What's behind that? So again, these are some really good questions to explore.
Can spiritual growth be fun?
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of these questions are really great ones for you to get into.
So we'll go into our last set of data here. Matea, take it away.
Awesome. The first two surveys answering our first two questions were, we were asking those questions of all young adults, whether or not they were Christian. And with this survey, we were really interested in, for young adults who are in the church already and identifying as Christian, believe in God, what happens then? If the goal isn't just to get, people in pews, what happens to young adults after they're in those pews? And so with this survey, we were really curious about what does faith maturity and growing in your faith look like, and what are the church and personal practices that contribute to that? So on this slide, you're going to see those 12 statements that make up a faith maturity scale that we used in our survey. And those capture a couple different dimensions of faith growth. So there's kind of a vertical dimension of sort of spirituality, personal spirituality that you can see there, like I seek opportunities to grow spiritually, or I have a real sense that God is guiding me. And then there's also an outward focused dimension, kind of a broader horizontal dimension of faith maturity and growth, where it's, I feel God's presence in my relationships with other people.
And these statements were generated from research or?
Yes, yep, it's an empirically supported scale, which is really great to use. So on this slide, we asked young adults about what are your personal spiritual practices and how often do you engage in those practices. So you can see on the bottom, we identified 9 common faith practices and asked young adults about the frequency of engaging in those practices. So you can see on the left, we've got caring for others, and young adults said they care for other people very often as a faith practice. But fasting on the right was the lowest rated faith practice. And then we were also interested not just what do young adults do most frequently, but what practices are predicting their faith growth the most. And so for those, you can see the white bars the white numbers on the green bars there. We identified prayer, worship, and reading scripture as the faith practices that most predicted faith growth. And then finally, we were also interested in what can the church do to be supportive of faith growth and create this environment that supports the faith growth of young adults. And so we identified 3 types of church practices, so faith growth practices, community building practices, and practices for openness that all contributed to the faith growth of young adults. And so there we've listed some bullet points and different ways that churches can engage in these practices.
Great. We've got a few more questions for this final reflection point. How do young adults at your church grow in their faith? How do the young adults at your church compare with this data? Specifically, a question for young adults, does this reflect your experience? We find that one of the points of struggle for some of the churches we've been working more closely with to understand contextualized stories is, do young adults have access to tell their own story? Are they in leadership? Do they represent enough of the congregation that their story is heard? Are they amplified loudly enough? So that's a really interesting question that we as a team have been asking our churches to reflect on. So practice with us. Some of the other questions, what are your practices for deepening faith? What spiritual practices would you like to offer that you're maybe not offering? And what has been working in your congregation for young adult faith growth that you could support better? So in what ways are you doing well that you could even knock it out of the park further? Jeff, what thoughts do you have on this last set of data?
Well, it was interesting just in looking at the previous slide when you look at the percentages of how young adults grow in their faith. And with 33% of it being faith growth practices that all have active verbs as part of it, helping, acting, talking, feeling responsible for, a lot of the language that we found with faith growth practices is that the church gives some kind of burden in a good way of doing something about what we believe, right? Not just believing it, but actually acting out on it, which parallels a lot of things we're seeing with young adults, is they're attracted to communities where my entire body, my entire soul, my entire mind is activated. And so be thinking about what those practices look like for you as a church, how you describe them. And maybe there's a disconnect where you're doing many of the things that are seen here, but the young adults and the way they're seeing it in your community don't see them happening. That could be one thing. Or maybe there's a way of retooling what you do to make it a more active practice as merely just a way of memorization or beliefism, which sometimes people see in churches doing as well. So these are really good questions, particularly also listening to the young adults who are maybe coming from outside your community, describing what's meaningful to them. And maybe there's ways to connecting the language that they're using with the language you're using and bring those things together as well.
Mm-hmm. So part of the effort of this video is to tell a little bit more of a narrative story to this data, which the data does tell a story. But we're really in the business of looking for narratives of what's going on in the young adult community in churches and outside of churches. And so we invite you to share your narrative with us. If you hear a great story at your church about how young adults are engaging, If you have questions about this data, if you hear a great story that you want to share with us about something that's not working, or you have questions about the statements we're using, we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to gather that information. Some of it we may write you back and say, hey, can we use this question or this prompt or this story in our research, because we think it's a poignant example of of a story we're hearing over and over again as we do this work. So you can always find us at pivotnw.org, pivotnw.org. And we hope that you maybe sign up for our newsletter, or just keep checking back, or like us on social media, so that we can keep sending you links and information and tools for engaging your young adults in your congregations. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks.